This is a very important panel on political advocacy. And as you know, we are entering into the political season in this country now. Once every 4 years we have it. Once every 4 years the political class comes out among us, and we need to reach them. We need to try to communicate to them that the American people want a space program that's actually going somewhere. And so these are three people on this panel who are all experienced in political advocacy. One of them is Rick Zucker, who is the leader of political work for Explore Mars. Casey Dreier, who is the director of public outreach for the and advocacy for the Planetary Society, and Art Harman, who was a longtime congressional aide to, I think, Congressman Stockman, if I'm not mistaken, who is basically the congressman from Johnson Space Center. And so they have a lot to say. And moderating the panel will be Lucinda, who was once upon a time the executive director of the Mars Society and has just resumed those responsibilities. So without further ado, the new executive director of the Mars Society, Lucinda.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for being here. This is quite loud. Is there anything? Just try to adjust this real quick. Is that better? Okay. Yes, I am recently reappointed as the new executive director for the Mars Society, and I'm really happy to be back. I'm really excited. Things have changed. The atmosphere is different. The public is talking about humans on Mars. We're about to enter into a new presidential election, and space advocacy is close to my heart, which is one of the reasons I joined the Mars Society back in 2002. So I'm really excited today to have our three panelists, and I'm going to actually introduce them again and give you their bios. Closest to me we have Art Harman. Art Harman is the director of the Coalition to Save Manned Space Exploration and was legislative director for Congressman Steve Stockman in the previous Congress. Stockman represented the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and Mr. Harman was his space advisor, as well as the co-founder of the Space Advocates Congressional Staff Association, the only staff organization in Congress to focus on space policy and strategy. He is a frequent guest on radio shows discussing the space program. During Mr. Harman's service in Congress, he became an expert in the Mars flyby concept to judge its feasibility for cooperation with NASA, or as the next bold mission for NASA. Mr. Harman has worked in the public policy arena for 3 decades in the nation's capital, served on the board of directors of 2 nonprofits, and is a television producer and photographer. He has traveled extensively in the world and returned home each time with greater appreciation for other cultures, as well as renewed appreciation for the liberties and opportunities Americans often take for granted. Thank you for being here. The next panelist is Rick Zuckerman. Rick Zucker joined Explore Mars Incorporated in March 2013. As its director of political outreach, is a leader in space advocacy and in developing space policy. He is well respected in the space community, particularly for his ability to help build consensus amongst diverse individuals and groups. Since 2008, Rick has chaired the Legislative Blitz, a grassroots visit to Congress by the Space Exploration Alliance, a coalition of nonprofit space advocacy organizations. Rick also chairs Explore Mars Incorporated grassroots visits to Congress known as Mars Day on the Hill. He is a member of the development team for the Humans to Mars report, an annual report which provides a comprehensive analysis of progress in the technical, political, and scientific fields, as well as in public perception relative to the human exploration of Mars. Rick is also a participant in the Mars Affordability and Sustainability workshops, including serving as one of the 3 senior editors for the report generated by the second of those workshops. Rick has also written, co-authored, and/or edited numerous articles, op-eds on space policy, space advocacy. Prior to joining Explore Mars Incorporated, Rick served the National Space Society, the NSS, in many capacities, including Executive Vice President, Chair of the Policy Committee, and as a member of the Board of Directors. He also served as the head of NSS Bequest Program and as a liaison to the Society's Board of Governors and Board of Advisors. Rick also served the NSS as its Vice President of Public Affairs, Chair of the Policy Implementation Subcommittee, and as a member of numerous other committees. Professionally, Rick is an attorney who received his undergraduate degree in political science from Brandeis University and his law degree from New York University School of Law. Rick is an experienced trial and appellate attorney with over 30 years in private practice representing numerous individuals and businesses in varied and complex civil matters. During his career, Rick served for several years as a Special Assistant Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Please welcome Rick Zucker. And also Art Harman. Okay. And our third panelist is Casey Dreier. As Director of Advocacy, Casey leads the strategic planning and implementation of the Society's political advocacy efforts. He works closely with the Society's leadership and Board of Directors and other policy experts to craft the organizational positions about the future of space exploration. He also works to foster strong relationships between the Society and its members, educate and engage the public about space policy, and to empower individuals to advocate for space. He is a regular contributor to the Planetary Report, blogs regularly about space policy, and tweets on Twitter at KC Dreier. He has a BA in physics from Oberlin College. Sorry, thank you. Please welcome all the panelists. So as Robert mentioned, and as I mentioned, next year is a new president election. And as part of what the Mars Study has typically done annually is gather our members and others interested and to make a move onto the Hill to forward human exploration for humans to Mars. So now we have our panelists here to give us all the information that we need, and let's get started. So our first question is, what do we need to do to get the public supporting a Humans to Mars program? And you can give us some ideas of what steps or methods or strategy that your organization takes on. Who would like to start?
Thank you, Lucinda, and thank you, Dr. Zubrin, for inviting me to attend here today. I think if we can answer that question, we'd be on Mars now. But let me give it a shot. Let me mention two specific areas that I think are absolutely critical. We need to educate the public better, and we need to rally the troops better. We're the troops. Everyone in this room is part of that meaning. My organization, Explore Mars, did something a couple of years ago because we wanted to find out what the public really thinks. There have been various public opinion polls over the years, but all of us in the room probably know that when we speak to people, lay people, a lot of people have a very skewed view of what the NASA budget actually is as a percentage of the federal budget. So what we've been hearing all kinds of crazy numbers up to 20% of the federal budget. Some people think that it's as big as the defense budget, or it's synonymous with the defense budget. So we commissioned this poll, and we decided to give the people some context. We told them in advance that the NASA budget is anywhere from 0 to 6% of the federal budget. And then we asked them, what do you think the actual number is? The poll came back with 2.6% of the federal budget. We have a real problem with public perception. We all know that the NASA budget is actually less than 1/2 of 1%. There's also a total misconception of, and we've heard that throughout this conference, as to what it actually will cost to get us to the moon, to Mars, and beyond. So we as space advocates must do a better job educating the public. And I'm sure we'll go into that in more detail later in the hour. Rallying the troops. It's absolutely critical that we have conferences like this so that everybody can keep up with the latest and greatest news. But we have to do more. Actually, let me ask people to raise their hands, and I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but this is critically important. Embarrass? Okay, I'm going to try to embarrass you. How many people in this room have attended a grassroots visits to Congress where you've actually gone to your senator or congressman's office and met either with the congressman or senator, or more likely with the staffer who handles space and science issues? Raise your hand. All right, that's pretty good. That's actually much more than I expected. But there are a lot of people in the room who haven't, and that's not a problem. How many in the room have on occasion, or let's say whenever the federal budget is released, it's supposed to be released in February, at the beginning of February, it usually is. On occasion it has not been. But it's released, and how many of you have called your senator or congressman's office or emailed them to say something about the budget? Please support the NASA budget, please increase the NASA budget, whatever. How many of you have done that? Okay. We can do a lot better. We have to do a lot better. If we don't do it, nobody will. And it's absolutely critical that our representatives hear from us. They hear from lobbyists. But when they hear that the average person on the street is interested in the space program, that means a lot.
Well, I'd certainly echo what you said. When I talk on the radio, one of the questions I get asked is, well, what's NASA doing since the space program was canceled? And sadly, that's the public perception. When we stopped the shuttles, so many people thought that was it. Well, you know, look up, 200 miles. We've got a space station there, and we're sending astronauts routinely. Perhaps the word routinely is part of the problem because it kind of fades away. And so space support by the public is generally, you could say, a mile wide and an inch deep. They love the space program. Kids love the space program. But in so many ways, it's all mission-driven. We don't have any missions. We've got, in 10 years, we will maybe go to an asteroid piece and ship some pieces off of it. And basically, that's our space program for the next decade. And so one of the key things is we have to demand real missions, real plans to get us truly to Mars and the moon. Simply, it's not going to happen under this administration. And that's why, as Dr. Zubrin was saying last night, we have to take advantage of the next, particularly the rest of this year, when presidential candidates are pretty accessible. And if you want to go out to Iowa, or you want to go to New Hampshire, then you'll have easy access to them. Hang out at any diner, they'll probably stop by, and you can probably bend their ear or their top staff and convince them that a space program is essential to the future of the United States. For Republicans, the message might be restoring basically the destruction of a manned space program, remaining competitive or in the lead over China and Russia, and I'll talk more about that later, and so forth. For Democrats, it might be more jobs, high-tech jobs, and restoring JFK's legacy. Issues like that can resonate. You got to make your voice heard and take advantage of the presidential campaign. Here's why this is so important. 4 years ago, what happened? Newt Gingrich bravely stood up and said, we're going to have a base on the moon. And it was a beautiful speech. It painted a great vision, and he really laid it out. It was kind of funny. Before he gave his speech, I called his campaign, talked to his communications director, and said, can you send me an embargoed copy of his speech so I can write about it the moment he gives it? And they said, oh, he doesn't have a speech. He's just going to speak from his knowledge. You know, that's the kind of person we need, but probably given the field of candidates, not the kind of person that we'll actually get as sitting in the White House in 2017. But what then happened? All of the other candidates piled upon him. Romney said famously, I'll fire anyone who proposes a moon base. Well, guess what? Until Obama killed our Moon and Mars program, a moon base was the national space strategy of the United States. That's the Constellation program. Would have taken us to the moon and then on to Mars. So I think he was just poorly advised, but that then took it away as an issue that could have been used in the presidential campaign 4 years ago as, hey, you know, we're on the other side from the president on space. They just neutralized it as an issue, and no one really talked about it in the campaign. So yeah, get busy. Get out there to New Hampshire, Iowa.
A quick follow-up on that. That same public opinion poll that we commissioned, when people were told what the actual numbers were, they were then asked, well, should we increase, decrease, or keep the NASA budget the same? 70% said we should double the NASA budget to 1%. Now, there's been a lot of discussion through this conference about whether that's going to happen, and I'm a firm believer that because of the way the political system is right now, that it's not realistic to expect huge increases in the NASA budget. But that poll did show that the public is in support of the space program. Certainly when the budgetary numbers are put in context, when they don't think that we're spending 20% of our budget on NASA alone. It's a very small percentage of the budget.
Yeah, well, not much to add beyond what's been discussed, but I think something really important is what Rick was saying, that we need to engage our top supporters and build new supporters into it year-round, and not even yearly, but every opportunity we can get, providing tools to educate and empower people to independently be able to go and represent, to create high, attentive space advocates who feel comfortable going out or making that phone call, making that email, and supporting these societies, like all of us up here, who are kind of on the ground day to day doing this stuff as well. So we need not just every 4 years, but it's a consistent year-round, year-in and year-out effort to follow a consistent goal in space, in our goals in space, to really build up this kind of support. I think something else that we have to remember is that we're in a minority here, right? Besides the Explore Mars poll, space has never been a high priority for most Americans. During Apollo was not considered worth it by most Americans, except for a brief period right after Apollo 11 landed. That's a good just reality check to remember, that not everyone feels the way we do about space as a priority. Now, that this does not mean that we give up on this, but what it does mean is that we have to focus our efforts even more. And we do have the advantage as well that there's no anti-space coalition out there either. So there's no one organizing against Mars. There's no one organizing against the moon or an increased NASA budget. It's effectively a consequence of our own ability to coalesce together and maintain a focused, consistent effort reaching out to your representatives.
Oh, there we go. So what do you think we need to do to get a larger portion of the population to support human space exploration? And who do you think is more important to convince then? The masses, the public, the government?
Can people hear me? I can't really. Okay. I think that if you look at the history, particularly of human spaceflight, but pretty much all spaceflight, there's never been a major program or mission that has really started because of overwhelming public demand. That's very important to remember, too. So we actually have to, and I talked about this last night for those of you who were at the debate, where creating a large coalition of stakeholders, public is part of that, but also industry, the scientific community, people within NASA, the NASA centers, agreeing on a certain goal and providing that larger support is really critical to the long-term sustainability and success of these programs. Again, there was no overwhelming public demand for a space station. There was no overwhelming public demand to go to the moon in 1961. Kennedy was ignoring the public polls, saying that the public was not overall supportive of the moon program because it was aligned with national security interests. Shuttle found a way to align itself with national priorities. International Space Station aligned with national priorities. I'm seeing a pattern here that we need to also acknowledge and find a way to create, or better to acknowledge and communicate the way that space aligns with national priorities at all levels to help us make that case and make a sustainable case. So fundamentally, I'm saying government itself needs to be committed to it, because there's no example, there's no counterexample that I'm aware of where the public has demanded and stood up and gotten a certain type of mission to happen.
I'm going to keep pushing probably the whole hour what we can do to help. I think it's very important for what the government perceives the general public is interested in. Government officials respond to the media because the media is a spokesperson for the general public. Again, if we in this room and other space advocacy organizations, if our voices are not heard, the general public's voices are not going to be heard. So again, I feel that the more we contact our elected representatives, they know that we represent, each one of us represents thousands of people. I would love if we could organize a huge rally in D.C. where 1 million people come and say, let's go to Mars within the next 10 years. That's not going to happen. But if they keep hearing from us, and that's why I asked before, have you gone to your elected representative's office? Have you called? Have you emailed? The more they hear from us, the more it's on their radar, because we heard earlier today that, and it was from Jeff Faust, I don't know if Jeff is still here, that so few representatives have space on their radar. Certainly if they're a space state, they have a NASA center there, there's a lot of NASA funding in their state, they're going to be supportive. But most representatives, most senators don't have that, and it's a minor issue to them. One of the things that we do when we go to Congress is we come armed with some data that you would expect them to have. How much NASA funding is in your state? How much NASA funding is in your district? That information is online. And we have educated those staffers who then go to their representative and say, hey, we actually have several $1 million of NASA funding in our district that they didn't even realize. Not just NASA centers, universities, small businesses. A lot of them aren't even aware of the small business program of NASA. So again, it's the perception by government of what the public is interested in, which I think is very important.
Definitely second that. And here's another thing. While NASA and the various companies, SpaceX and others, the members from those areas are indeed, very, very supportive of the space program, here's ways to talk to folks who have essentially no, space in their district. Kansas, go there. What's on that guy's mind? Agriculture and, maybe a few other issues, environmental issues. But wait a minute. Every single farmer in Kansas gets his crop data from satellites. GPS runs his tractors. All of these things, and then, you know, medical advances that we're getting from the space station and the overall space program that are helping extend people's lives. The spin-offs are an important part of this too, because that people can relate to in a real down-to-earth way. My grandmother got an MRI, and here's its connection to the space program. You know, that kind of thing. And, you know, what's next? If we're going to go to Mars, we're going to have to learn a lot more about teleoperations. You know, if you know, you're 300 days out and you got to take out an appendix, let's say. Well, maybe you'll have a little robotic operating room that can do that. Or you're on Mars and there's a, you know, you need to do some delicate operation. Once again, the things we'll be developing for that, that'll push the envelope. And that'll come back to everyone in the country, whether they're from Kansas or from, you know, the backyard of SpaceX in L.A.
Hello, there we go. Sorry about that. So what it sounds like you're saying, which is what has always, you know, Robert Zubrin has always told us at the Mars Society, which is we need a president who chooses to send humans to Mars, and we go from there, who makes a decision and a choice, and that's our goal. So I just heard last night, I saw a video, of a student meeting with one of the presidential-elect, Trump, and he asked him last night, so are you going to send humans to Mars? And Trump, of course, said something, well, we need to build infrastructure, but yes, we can send humans to Mars. Maybe Trump will build us a settlement on Mars, since he likes to build so much. So what do you think about that, getting behind one of the presidents who want to send humans to Mars, if that is part of their campaign?
Well, as I said earlier, this is exactly the key to getting to Mars, getting to the moon, anywhere we want to be going, because it really is driven by the president. When, you know, Nixon killed Apollo after Apollo 11, but we were able to rally and get ISS built, the shuttles built, things like that, but it all was top down. You know, unless we can get that million people at the Capitol saying we need to get to Mars, then we've got to make sure that all of the candidates are in support of a space program that's far better than what we have now and has a real purpose and direction, and that and that they're not attacking each other for being pro-space. Again, that was the mistake of 4 years ago. We didn't inoculate the other candidates, so when Newt gave his speech, they were tearing him down. There's already been a few candidates who have spoken out on space. It's glad to hear what Trump said. Bush has said some positive things. Cruz, of course, is the chairman of the Space Subcommittee in the Senate, and he's got a good record there. There was an article I saw yesterday that Bernie Sanders once had an interview in which he basically said, oh, we shouldn't be spending money on NASA, we should give the money to the poor. Oh, dear. Chances are the poor will benefit from medical and other advances far more than little cash handouts. When I'm on the radio, I'll sometimes tell people, take out your cell phone, put it in the blender. Each piece you pick out of the blender has more computing power than was on Apollo. But it was Apollo that really helped drive the engine, push the envelope to get us the microelectronics that now, 40, 50 years later, gives us an amazing computer that we merely call a phone in everyone's pocket. So space is an investment in our future. It's not a cost.
It's absolutely critical to have a president who's in support of the space program, but I don't think that's the only answer. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about that. I think we have to get not only the president but the Congress on board, and I think that the political atmosphere, excuse the pun, is such that Congress is looking to cut funding and has been for a number of years rather than increase funding. So in our visits to Congress over the past few years, we have been fighting so that there wouldn't be any cuts. And we actually, overall, did a pretty good job. And it wasn't just us, but the whole space community rallied. But we've been fighting so there wouldn't be any cuts, or the cuts would be minimal. Again, I think the best we can do, and this has been the focus of several workshops that was mentioned in my bio that Explore Mars has hosted. So far, we did one 2 years ago. We did another one this past year. We're doing another one in this December. It's called the Affording Mars Workshops. How can we get to Mars under the current budget scenarios? And what we're looking at is having budgets that increase with inflation, and at best, having temporary spikes where they're needed. And I think that's the best we can hope for in the current political atmosphere.
Yeah, so I'm seeing a few people already start to nod off, which just reminds me the difficulty of actually doing advocacy, which is that it's policy and it's politics and it's lots of debating about how to communicate and build blah, blah, blah. And it's fundamentally, this is actually, just to change the subject just a little bit, this is what's so hard in a way in our jobs, trying to get people who love space even to be interested in the policy part of making space happen. Because fundamentally, we all want to see people go further out into space. We want to see the pictures from Saturn, from Pluto, from the surface of Mars. And people don't want to learn about the FY 2016 budget request scenario and then the CJS appropriations process through the Senate and the House and all of that stuff, because it seems so far removed. And this is something that I just grapple with, is how to make this engaging and not make people nod off, because it is, sometimes it's a little boring and gets into the weeds. And finding ways, we're trying to develop ways to just make people, I think that making people see the connection and feel the connection is going to help with that. I mean, I personally come to DC all the time, and every time I come, I need to go to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum to remind myself why I'm doing this, right? I look at the space shuttle, or I look at the Apollo 11, or Pioneer 11 is my favorite. And it's just, oh yeah, this is the consequences of all of these meetings that I'm wearing suits for and so forth. And so this is just a fundamental issue that even among space advocates, we do not get high rates of people taking action and even doing the most minimal sort of activity for reaching out to emailing their representatives, much less calling them, or, God bless them, the people who come all the way out to meet with them in person here in DC. So that's something that we're desperately trying to figure out a better way to engage people in, because I think there is a real, in a sense, market for that. So that's my little side thing. And then let me toss some additional cold water on the president's thing. So, of course, I think having a president fond of the space program is great, but I'm going to give you a couple examples: the Space Exploration Initiative, the Vision for Space Exploration, and the Obama Space Program. I don't even know if that one had a name, I forget. All of those had presidential grand goals. Of course, the first George Bush, that was slapped down by Congress. You had George W. Bush's Vision for Space Exploration. The money never showed up. We had Jack Schmitt last night, the Apollo 17 astronaut, saying, like, well, George W. was behind it, but then the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, just never let the money flow to NASA. Well, who does the OMB work for? The OMB works for the president, the executive branch. And so there's issues here beyond just having a president who's, and then Obama's space plan canceled Constellation and Orion. What do we have now? We still have Orion, and we have a reconfigured heavy lift vehicle, which was not part of that original plan. And so this is the coalition building. This is getting Congress and authorization as well as the money appropriations together on the same page, but also just having a general strategic goal that we're trying to pursue that lasts over time. And so having a president is good, but it's not the end-all and be-all of what we want here. Again, Kennedy was able to do what he did because it was a proxy battle of the Cold War. You had pure national security interest driving that. We do not have that clarifying external force, which in many ways, thank God, because we're not under threat of mutual assured destruction anymore. But we have to think of ways to build a stronger coalition that sustains these types of goals over time. And so president's good, but that's just a piece of that puzzle.
Just a couple of more points. I want to speak to my generation for a moment and to my kids' generation for a moment. Let me do the latter first. My kids' generation is great with social media. I'm just getting used to Facebook. It takes me a long time to work.
You're already way behind now. So
I know. I still have an AOL. Forget it. My kids' generation is very, very good at social media. So to the younger generation in this room, I see a few, you can do a lot with that. If you see something going on in the space program, post it. You have lots of friends. They have lots of friends. It's amazing how that gets distributed to a lot of different people. To my generation, I get very frustrated with my generation sometimes because I'm still very idealistic. I grew up with Apollo, like so many of us here did. And I remember those days where every 6 months or so we were doing something completely new, had never been done before. I want to see those days again. But we're not very good with social media. So that's why I mentioned at the beginning about what we can do, as well as the younger generation. If you can't come to one of our events in Washington, you can pick up the phone. You can email the congressional offices. Something that will take a little bit more of your time, and it's not guaranteed it will work. You could write a short article, 150 words, no more, and send it into your local newspaper. I say 150 words because that's usually the limit for an op-ed in most newspapers. And it may get published. It may not, but it may get published. And that's how we reach a lot of different people.
Very good. I'd like to give you all a little bit of a scare moment, and that is, you're mentioning, is there a space race, Sputnik moment, and so forth. And we are in a space race. We're in a very hard-fought space race with China. It may not seem that way because of the way the Chinese operate. The Chinese tend to do very quiet preparations, and then they'll spring the full bore. They made a few prototype stealth fighters from plans they stole from us. Now they're cranking them out. They sent up a few astronauts. They've got a little teeny space station. But they're building the world's largest rocket factory. It'll make anything we have dwarf by comparison, even SpaceX. So they will be on the moon, probably in the early to mid-2020s. And then they will go to Mars. We should count on that. We should not say, well, I don't think they're really going. They seem kind of hesitant on doing space. No, they're building up in a very typically Chinese fashion. Slow and quiet, and then spring it on them. And so probably within a few years, we're going to see a real explosion in the numbers of projects that they do. They're planning to build a space station. Won't be as large as ours, but they will then be sending astronauts to that, probably training for deep space missions. and then going to the moon. They want to mine helium-3 on it. Harrison Schmidt, I believe, was talking about that last night. And if they have a lunar base, and then they go on to Mars, and they get the firsts, how are we going to convince Congress and the White House that, well, we should kind of be there too? I don't think it'll fly. I think our space program will collapse. I don't think we'll have the same kind of Sputnik moment that we had back in with Sputnik, 1957, that there was like a panic. Oh my God, they're getting ahead of us. Well, we need to be having those discussions now. We can't keep it quiet. We can't pretend it's not happening. It is happening, and again, you know, Chinese inscrutability, perhaps. It's the way they operate. And I'd say this here too, that space, the moon, and/or Mars, dominated by the tyrannies, China and perhaps Russia, will not be friendly to the United States. They will not be friendly to commercial space. If you think, oh, you know, SpaceX can fly to the moon or Mars, they may find it very hostile. You know, China can throw a lot of obstacles in the way of doing things. As an example, what are they doing in the South China Sea? They're taking over, they're trying to destroy 400 years of common law and practice of international seas being international and free and not owned by any nation by taking over the entirety of the South China Sea, literally right up to the borders of you know, the beaches of a few countries. And they're threatening war if countries object. And they're building militarized islands that with runways and naval bases and so forth to enforce their phony claims that they now own international waters. So we should not trust that they will not claim the moon or Mars and say, you know, we'll take action against you. Now, you know, it's not like the science fiction movies of the 50s or something with great space battles. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is for China to say, look, we've mapped the moon, we've got our base here, you guys were there 50 years ago, it's clear you had no interest in returning, so the moon is ours. You know, if you want rare earth minerals, if you want, don't want wars in the South China Sea and with your allies, Japan and other countries, then you're just simply not going there. They could do that. And again, it doesn't take guns on the moon to blast spaceships out of the skies. All it takes is typical Chinese muscle delivered exactly the same way that they do every day to bully their way in the world. So please take that as a very, very great threat that should inspire us in one way or another to get busy and before it's a Chinese base on the moon. We're still looking for the perfect asteroid boulder to grab, bring it to the moon, and we're going to sit there and pick at that and bring back some pieces while they're building, you know, launching their 12th mission to the moon and you know, have a permanent moon base, and maybe the Russians are doing the same thing. We got to look at what the rest of the world, they're not going to wait for us.
Thank you. Really great points. And we are going to take questions for 10 minutes, but I just wanted to ask one last question from you. So if, in your advocacy work, what has been some of the hard, difficult realities of getting support for our human spaceflight program? And what do you do if you are trying to rally the troops and you come up to someone who may not be a space advocate and who maybe actually doesn't want to send humans to Mars?
One of the things I try to do in that situation is try to bring it home to the people I'm talking to. I try to make it real. I hear so many times we're spending all this money in space, and we're not. We're spending all that money on Earth. And I try to make it real for them about the benefits that have come out of the space program that have helped them, their loved ones, and others. A few years ago, and I wish I had them here today, NASA put out several cards that showed, NASA calls them spin-offs. I don't like that term. In our work, we've been calling them space applications because that's really what it is. What has come out of the space program that improves life on Earth? And one of the cards was showing your house and all the things that you have in your home that came right out of the space program that have improved your life in your house. Another one was medical technology. Art, I think you mentioned MRI technology. These were very powerful instruments, and we actually took them to Congress one year. And you would think that the congressional offices have seen them. No, they didn't. Some of them did, but many didn't. I try to make it real for the people that the space program does affect them and does directly benefit them.
All great points. I think one of the core difficulty is that there's no kind of one easy answer to why particularly human spaceflight is needed or worth it. And last year's Pathways Report to for Human Exploration from the National Research Council really kind of addressed this head on. You know, there's all of these different arguments you can make, but no single one of them is truly compelling. It's kind of the sum of them. There's these amorphous ideas like national pride and capability, but fundamentally, you know, we actually have this program that was developed for a national security driven motivation back in the 1960s, and we still have this program, so in a sense it's kind of looking for rationalization after the fact. That makes it hard to someone who's skeptical to come up and say, oh, this is the reason. There's a lot of good reasons to do it, but when you're in what a lot of people consider very tight fiscal times, it becomes harder and harder to clarify that in a way that's compelling against the very other, you know, basic infrastructure needs, as Trump said, after fixing roads and bridges. Sure, you know, that's a pretty big project these days. That's way more expensive than a space program. So that is just something, again, I think we have to at least internalize that before we go and make these arguments, that in a sense, we are coming from a position where we need to make the stronger case and make that consistent case. And again, fundamentally, that I think is education, a lot of what Rick was talking about, and making giving people context for understanding what we do actually spend on space as a percentage of spending, discretionary even, or with mandatory spending, is very small. Keeping human spaceflight going, you know, doesn't require tons of money in the way that people are thinking grand Apollo-style programs. It's, you know, something that is very doable with the amount of money government spends. Or I always like to say that there's a misplaced improper payments that the government does, about $100 billion a year. Medicaid makes $20 billion of improper payments per year. That's more than NASA's budget, right? So there's lots of ways in which the money is spent, I say not worse, but even more wastefully than some people would think that it's spent on important things like human spaceflight, and particularly science. So that's something that I think that's what makes it fundamentally difficult, but also a great opportunity. And then fundamentally what this is education and creating as much outreach to broader communities as possible.
Hello. I want to give you a little idea of the workings of a congressional office for those who have never been to Congress or haven't really delved into it. You might think that there is an expert for everything, and that's not the case. The guy from Kansas, the legislative staff he has, he's going to have somebody who knows agriculture inside and out, and who knows maybe EPA inside and out, and 2 or 3 other issues that really affect his district, her district. And, you know, as a legislative director, if I'm hiring somebody for that office, you know, that's what I'm doing. Now then, I'll divvy up the committee assignments, you know, the various issues by committees. And so maybe the ag guy, I'll also give science, the science committee, which includes the space subcommittee, which is, of course, NASA. But that doesn't really necessarily mean the guy has an interest in it or much knowledge about it. It says, well, I need somebody to be responsible for that if anybody inquires. And so if you're not in one of those space states, or you don't have a member who really likes space, then you're probably not going to be finding anyone who really understands the space program and its benefits. That gets back to what we've been discussing today. It's essential to be talking to your members of Congress and their staff. So when you call and you say, I'd like to speak to the legislative assistant who handles NASA, they'll probably connect you to somebody. It may be the ag guy who will say, well, yeah, that's one of my committees. But then if you talk to them, you get a little bit of dialogue. Email them back and forth, and they'll always happily give you their emails. Then you can kind of get them to see the light and how it relates to that district, which may have nothing apparent to do with space or even in investments. And you can make it real to them. You know, well, you know, MRIs and other things. Your every tractor in your state runs on GPS and satellite images and so forth. So that's a little bit of the things that you need to be doing at the grassroots level that can really make a difference. Because when there's a bill to, you know, NASA authorization, and that's going to get a little edgy by forcing the president to do things he doesn't want to do, like, say, restoring our heavy lift rocket, SLS. That was really edgy. But we had enough support in Congress to actually do it at that moment. And that was a great feat that, you know, thankfully probably many of you all were calling Congress. So just little tips of how a congressional office operates and why it may not seem they're very interested. Your job's to help make them interested.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have maybe 2 minutes for really quick questions. Are there any questions from the audience? We do have volunteers coming around with microphones. There's a hand, please. Yes?
I wanted to bring up that you talked about Newt Gingrich and the way his thing went flopped in 2012. And knowing his philosophy, I think he would have implemented a non-conventional commercial approach, sort of like what Charles Miller was describing this morning. But Newt never really communicated that well, and his opponents attacked him for, you know, that scary figure of a $500 billion program. So how do we communicate the fact that we really can do things for a lot less and more innovatively than the traditional way of doing things and the perception people have that that's inevitable?
I think, that's a lot louder. Repeating this over and over, just honestly, just saying it over and over, the cost of space is just a fundamental misperception that a lot of people have. This is something I did way back when Curiosity landed. I did a study using LexisNexis, and I looked at how news organizations referenced the Curiosity rover. And it wasn't just NASA's Curiosity rover, it was NASA's $2.5 billion Curiosity rover. That was just part of the basic name of it was the cost. Most federal projects don't have the cost as a fundamental part of its, you know, proper noun. And that gives people, I think, the perception, because $2.5 billion is a lot of money, but they don't say $2.5 billion spent over 10 years, you know, as part of an annualized budget of $4 trillion. That's something we just have to keep saying again and again and again. And this actually gives me a little bit of leeway because, you know, we're going to hear about MAVEN next. We have to look at where things work really well. MAVEN is a NASA mission that just knocked it out of the park. They came in under budget. Who's reporting that, right? That's, you know, that doesn't get in the news. We need to acknowledge when missions come in under budget. They went through a government shutdown right before launch, and they still launched on time, on you know, under budget, and the thing is working perfectly. So we have a somewhat of a media bias to reporting when things go wrong, and always reporting the costs of things. The moon mission thing is a good example. Space exploration initiative from the first Bush presidency was, everyone calls it the $500 billion mission. Well, everyone forgets it was creating a space station, making a heavy lift shuttle, permanent moon base, and regular trips to Mars was part of that $450 billion. That wasn't just Mars, that was a lot of other things in there. Communicating the lower cost of these things, which is what Explore Mars is doing really well, which Dr. Zuber has been doing for a long time with Mars Society, that is something we just have to say until we're blue in the face.
Really quickly, please. Very quick.
Regarding Newt, I'd say delivery style has a little bit to do with it. Newt is sort of a policy geek and comes across that way. So when but then his enemies sort of mixed in earlier statements. So we, you know, if we had 50,000 people on the moon, we could make it a state and so forth. You know, statements from years ago, and they mixed that in to make it sound like that's what he was advocating for, when no, he wanted a research base, which would have cost, you know, a lot less than putting 50,000 people on the moon.
Rick, did you want one quick last word?
30 seconds, and I just want to shift gears, if I may do a plug for the Legislative Blitz.
Quick.
Okay.
Thank you.
The Space Exploration Alliance is made up of 10 space advocacy groups: the Mars Society, my organization, Explore Mars, the Planetary Society, and 7 others. We go to Congress every year at the end of February, and we time it because the budget usually comes out at the beginning of February. We traditionally get 30 to 45 people coming to these events because we actually haven't done a great job getting the word out. Even with that number of people, we have been doing approximately 100 meetings over 2 days. We did a fabulous job. All the organizations, or particularly Explore Mars, the Planetary Society, and the Mars Society, got the word out last year. We had 70 people sign up. It was during a snowstorm, so we lost a few people. We had 65 people. We did 170 meetings over those 2 days. I want to hit 200 this year, so, and anybody in this room can do it. We go in teams. You don't have to be an expert. They don't want to hear from experts. They hear from experts all the time. They want to hear from us. So if you're interested, send me an email, rick.zucker@exploremars.org. Thank you.
Excellent way to end. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists.